I want to begin by thanking Senator Grassley, the co-chair of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control, and the other members of the caucus who have joined us for this hearing, namely Senator Whitehouse. I also have the pleasure of serving with Senator Whitehouse on the Intelligence Committee, and he's been absolutely super in that regard. I think there's no question that Afghanistan is a significant source of opium. 90% of the world's illicit opium comes from Afghanistan, although probably 5% of it comes to this country. The opium is processed into heroin, sold across the globe, and the impacts are broad. It's an estimated 50% of all Afghan heroin is smuggled through Iran. From there, it fuels drug epidemics in Western Europe and Russia, strengthening the criminal elements in those countries. Although seen in only about 5% of our country, Afghan heroin accounts for about 50% of the market in Canada, indicating Afghan heroin is a clear threat to the Western Hemisphere. Opium production in Afghanistan is on the rise. In 2001, the country produced a few hundred kilograms. Today, that number has grown to 8 metric tons. There's also a mixed view on whether the Afghan opium market is funding the Taliban, to what degree, and I feel it is, and that this clearly needs to be stopped. Last December, the United States Department of Defense changed its policy to enable the United States Armed Forces to directly support the counter-narcotics missions conducted by the DEA and their Afghan counterparts. The shift in Defense Department policy has led to a number of successful operations. In May of this year, DEA's Foreign Deployed Advisory and Support Team, known by the acronym FAST, the Afghan National Interdiction Unit, the Afghan National Army, and a United States Special Forces team seized 18,164 kilograms of opium, 200 kilograms of heroin, 1,000 kilograms of hashish, 72,000 kilograms of poppy seed, chemicals used to make drugs, and a significant cache of weapons, including 44 blocks of Iranian C4, improvised explosive devices, mortar rounds, and other weapons used to attack coalition forces. United States-funded eradication efforts also have changed significantly. In June, the United States revamped its strategy to include increased funding for the Alternative Livelihood Crop Substitution Program. This program replaces the opium poppy crop, with U.S.-supplied seeds for watermelon, wheat, and other alternatives. The $300 million effort, led by the United States AID and the United States Department of Agriculture, is ambitious. It encompasses a comprehensive approach to crop replacement while sustaining, hopefully, the Afghan farmer. The effort, we believe, or I believe, cannot succeed without security, without the ability to get supplies to the farmers, and without the ability to produce to market, free of bribes and physical threats. At the same time, we need to ensure that aid goes to farmers and not to corrupt Afghan government officials. The judicial process is in the process of major reforms. There have been successful prosecutions of those involved in Afghanistan's narcotics trade. Under the federal narco-terrorism statute, Title 21 U.S.C. 960A, which was enacted in March of '06, several high-value narcotic terrorists have been removed from Afghanistan to face justice in the United States. Khan Mohammed was captured by DEA and Afghan counter-narcotics police in Nangarhar province in October of '06. In May of '08, Khan Mohammed became the first person convicted in United States Federal District Court of narco-terrorism since the statute was enacted. Khan Mohammed was sentenced to 2 life sentences. In October '08, Haji Juma Khan, was arrested in Indonesia based on an international arrest warrant stemming from a narco-terrorism indictment. He was placed into DEA custody and transported to New York, where today he waits trial. He is one of the world's most significant heroin and opium traffickers who has provided direct support to the Taliban from his drug trafficking revenues. This federal narco-terrorism statute has proven effective, not only in Afghanistan, but against other terrorist organizations, such as the FARC in Colombia. It has been tested and proven to be an effective tool in a court of law now in the United States. So I look forward to hearing your ideas about other tools we might use to not only combat the Afghan drug trade, but to improve an independent judiciary in this troubled country. We have three witnesses, Senator Grassley and Senator Whitehouse, and let me just quickly welcome them and then turn to you for your comments. The first is Mike Braun. He has been here before. He is the managing partner of Spectre Group International. He retired from the DEA after 33 years in law enforcement as the agency's chief of operations. He is considered an expert on drug law enforcement and narco-terrorism. Mr. Braun has testified numerous times, as I said. The next is Noreen MacDonald. She is president and founder of the International Council on Security and Development. This policy think tank analyzes and investigates the relationship between counter-narcotics, military, and developmental policies, and their consequences for Afghanistan's reconstruction efforts. Since 2005, Ms. MacDonald has worked and traveled extensively in Afghanistan and has witnessed firsthand the terrible effects of the country's past and current conflicts. She has traveled from Afghanistan to be here today, and we really thank her very much. And she has the wonderful ability of not even looking jet lagged, so we thank her for that. And the final witness is Vanda Fella-Brown, Foreign Policy Fellow, Brookings. She is the author of the book scheduled to be released next month, entitled Shooting Up, Counterinsurgency and the War on Drugs. I want to thank you for being with us today as well. So why don't I turn to you, Senator Grassley, for your opening comments, and then we'll just go right down the line.
To save time, I've got 4 points to make, but I'm only going to make one and put the rest on the record. And I do this mainly to alert my colleagues on the committee to some plans I've continuing from last Congress. I believe a solution to the growing influence of our narcotics trade in Afghanistan is to cut off the flow of illicit funds that result from the drug trade. I've been an outspoken advocate for reforming our nation's anti-money laundering laws, not just for the purpose of Afghanistan, but for the purpose of global money laundering. I introduced comprehensive legislation in previous Congresses that would help hit terrorists, criminal, and drug traffickers where it hurts them most in their pocketbooks. I'm currently finalizing an updated version of this legislation and hope to introduce it in the near future. I've heard from a number of law enforcement officials that we urgently need to update our laws to combat evolving trends. We need our laws to be up to date and flexible so that the source of money fueling this conflict is cut off before it can be used to fund violence, whether it's terrorism or otherwise. Only once we cut off the flow of these illicit funds can we truly make a dent in the illicit activity of terrorists and drug traffickers. So I hope my colleagues on the Drug Caucus and the Judiciary Committee would join me after you study the bill in supporting these efforts to reform our anti-money laundering laws, and I would look forward to any suggestions on any particular language change that needs to be made in order to make sure that it's effective and gets broad support. And I'll put the rest of my statement in the record.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. I'm afraid I gave Dr. Vanda Phillips-Brown's intro bit of a quick once-over, and I just want to acknowledge that she is a fellow in foreign policy in the 20th Century Defense Initiative at Brookings, and an adjunct professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. So we thank you. Mr. Braun, why don't we begin with you?
I will step out to the restroom.
Madam Chairman, Co-Chairman Grassley, Senator Whitehouse, others gathered here today, my esteemed colleagues, our co-panelists, thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. Senator, you were talking about, or in your opening comments, you mentioned a major operation back in May that the DEA, our Afghan Counternarcotics Police, and our military forces undertook in Afghanistan. Let me bring you up to date just a little bit with a more recent example. Just last week, those same organizations raided a heroin lab in southern Afghanistan, and seized at the lab was 1.8 metric tons of heroin and morphine, and that's a big haul in anyone's book. You have been around these hallowed halls for quite some time now. You know narcotics trafficking very, very well, and you understand that is a big haul. What's more troubling about that particular operation, though, was the laboratory was not simply being guarded by the Taliban, it was being operated by the Taliban. My point being is I believe that the Taliban is rapidly evolving into what I refer to as a truly hybrid terrorist organization. They're one part designated terrorist organization, but they are becoming a global drug trafficking powerhouse. What's most amazing about that particular operation also, Senator, is that right along with the drugs, there were IEDs, IED bomb-making materials. There was Taliban propaganda, including training manuals and the like. And this is a scenario that the DEA, our special forces, and our brave Afghan counterparts have seen on numerous occasions over the past couple years since our military has become more heavily involved in supporting law enforcement in taking the fight to the traffickers and the Taliban. What we're seeing, I'm convinced, is not only an unmistakable but an unequivocal convergence of drugs and terrorism.
Where exactly was the lab?
It was in southern Afghanistan.
In which province? Kandahar?
I believe it was in Kandahar province, I believe. And in fact, I received a phone call from one of my former colleagues or partners at DEA. There was another lab hit in southern Afghanistan within the past 48 hours. 10 Taliban were killed. This was a raid conducted by U.S. Special Forces and DEA in support of the Afghan Counter-Narcotics Police and Afghan Army Commandos. Another recent example, we're seeing this over and over and over again. Again, these folks aren't just providing security anymore, they're now involved in wholesale production. This is nothing new. We've seen this, we've seen the same evolutionary process, if you will, happen to the FARC in our Western Hemisphere, the remnants of the AUC, the ELN, as well as Sendero Luminoso in Peru. You're hearing from a retired federal narcotics officer, so that's the kind of perspective you're going to get today. I've served in a number of nasty places around the globe, up close and personal, going against bad guys. That's the kind of perspective you're going to get from me. But one thing that I do want to mention is this is not just based on my past experience, this growing convergence of drugs and terrorism. I stumbled across a study a couple of years ago that was conducted at Stanford University in California. Professor James Farron identified and studied 128 insurgencies and civil wars from just after the end of the end of World War II until the year 2000. The name of the study was "Why Some Wars Last Longer Than Others." And what the professor found is during this period, these 128 insurgencies and civil wars, of those 128, On average, they lasted about 8 years in length, all of them, on average. However, he isolated and identified 17 that lasted at least 5 times longer than the other 111. The only common thread that was running through those 17 were those anti-government forces generated their own contraband revenue. My point being is I have been convinced for a long, long time, and I have shared this over and over with a number of combatant commanders and other high-ranking personnel from DOD over the past several years and our intelligence community. We're not going to get out of Afghanistan, or we're not going to win the fight. We may get out, but we're not going to win the fight unless we provide the same level of passion and vigor against the drug trafficking activity and drug production activity in that country as we are in fighting terrorism and the insurgency. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Braun. Dr. Philip Brown.
This absolutely critical issue of how narcotics and counter-narcotics...
Could you pull the mic close
Sure.
to you?
Is it better now?
Yeah.
So it's an honor to address the caucus on how narcotics and counter-narcotics policies affect the security environment as well as political environment and economic opportunities in Afghanistan. Narcotics production is critical to all these 3 areas. However, premature and inappropriate counter-narcotics policies greatly complicate counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism objectives and also jeopardize economic reconstruction and state building. They are also unsustainable and indeed counterproductive for even the narrow goal of narcotics suppression. You've already indicated that the Taliban is making substantial amount of money on the order of tens of millions, perhaps as much as $100 million a year from the drug trade. And this accounts for as much as half of its income. However, it is important to also note that very many other actors in Afghanistan also participate in the drug trade. The broad scope, of course, it is the population that is frequently critically dependent on the illicit poppy economy for basic livelihood. In a country where between 1/3 and 1/2 of the country's GDP comes from drugs and much of the rest from foreign aid, the economic importance of the illicit poppy economy is just tremendous. And not simply in the countryside, much of economic activity in urban areas is also underpinned indirectly by profits from drugs. Tribal chiefs, political power brokers, members of the Afghan government, members of the police, all to various degrees participate in the drug trade. It is also important to note that the Taliban makes much more than simply money from the poppy economy. Crucially, it makes what I call political capital, namely support and legitimacy with the population. And they obtain this by being able to protect the illicit poppy economy against efforts to suppress it from the government or the international community. In many ways, the ability to protect the poppy fields is at the core of the Taliban support today, in addition to the ability to outperform the government in the variety of other public goods provisions and being able to capitalize on the sense of Gilzai Pashtun marginalization. Eradication efforts then, in the absence of illicit livelihoods, do not generate the desired outcome of suppressing poppy production, and yet they enhance the bond between the Taliban and the population. And we have seen that in a number of areas in Afghanistan, including in Nangarhar, and I'll be happy in the Q&A to get into details of what's happening in Nangarhar as well as Helmand on Kandahar. Let me just briefly say that eradication has not bankrupted the Taliban. Indeed, eradication has not yet bankrupted any single belligerent group anywhere in the world, including the FARC in Colombia. In fact, the Taliban reconstituted itself in Pakistan between 2002 and 2004 in the absence of having access to much of the poppy economy. Eradication strengthens the Taliban physically by driving economic refugees into its hands. It alienates the local population from tribal chiefs and members of the Afghan government, and it motivates the population not to provide intelligence on the Taliban to Afghan National Army, police, and NATO forces. The shift that the Obama administration has indicated toward much more robust focus on rural development and interdiction is appropriate. I have some concerns about how rural development is being conceptualized and the very narrow focus on wheat, which in many ways is distinctly inappropriate for Afghanistan. The rural development efforts must be much more multifaceted and address all drivers of poppy cultivation, which go way beyond price profitability. And it needs to focus on high labor intensity, high value crops, which wheat is not. I also applaud the new focus on interdiction. I have, again, several concerns that should be addressed in the way the interdiction policy is conceptualized. One of which is that a simply selective focus on Taliban-linked traffickers sends the signal that the best way to be a drug trafficker in Afghanistan is to be a member of the Karzai government or whatever the future Afghan government will be. And finally, I want to stress that security is the critical prerequisite for success in suppressing in a sustainable way the narcotics economy. Neither eradication nor rural development can be successful without security in place. And indeed, counterinsurgent forces have the capability to win against belligerent groups that are linked to drugs. We see these efforts in Colombia, even though the size of the coca economy is as high as it was at the beginning of Plan Colombia. In many ways, we have seen it in Burma, Thailand, Peru, and many other areas.
Thank you very much. Ms. McDonald?
Thank you, Chairman Feinstein, and other distinguished members of the caucus, for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Pull the mic down a little bit and be sure.
Is that a bit better?
Thank you, that's fine.
Our organization, the International Council on Security and Development, ICOS, is a project of the Network of European Foundations, which brings together 12 Europe-based foundations, as well as the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation in the United States. Over the past years, ICOS has been working in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia. We have a particular focus in southern Afghanistan, where we have a permanent field office in Lashkargah City in Helmand Province. We do research on security and development, Taliban presence and recruitment, the political and election process, and we have a special focus on counter-narcotics. I have led our field research team in southern Afghanistan these last 4 years. I've seen the return of the Taliban firsthand. Although over the past years there has been some small temporal victories in our struggle against the illegal opium economy in Afghanistan, we still losing ground in our overall fight against what has become a main obstacle on Afghanistan's road to stability and development. What we have learned since 2003, when counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan really started, is that aggressive crop eradication without solid short-term alternative development strategies has had only 2 structural effects: more poverty and more support for the Taliban. In this sense, our counter-narcotic efforts have so far unfortunately worked at cross purposes, considering our overarching strategy to win the hearts and minds of the people in Afghanistan. We welcome the statement of the new administration to halt forced poppy crop eradication, which was clearly a failing policy. Interdiction surely is an important part of our response, and this administration's renewed commitment is important. In our view, the involvement of members of the provincial and federal governments in Afghanistan in opium trafficking is a challenge that must now be taken up by the international community, having been neglected in favor of political expediency in the past. As you may know, we at ICOS have launched a Poppy for Medicine proposal in 2005, which is a joint counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency initiative. As such, it intends to bridge the gap between today's political and economic realities in Afghanistan and the longer-term impact of current alternative livelihood programs. The key feature of Poppy for Medicine model is that opium would be transformed into morphine tablets in the Afghan villages, adding to the employment base in the rural areas. This entails licensed production run by a specially designed village shura control process in collaboration with the central government and international actors. We have developed over the last years in a consultative process detailed protocols regarding control and establishing a competitive farm gate price. There is a global shortage for morphine, especially in the developing world, and ironically, in Afghanistan itself. The United States has previously used licensing of opium for medicine as a response to opium trafficking in Turkey and India, starting in the 1970s, to good effect. Apart from the economic benefits of poppy for medicine, in many areas this project would provide us with one of the first opportunities to build a positive relationship between the Afghan people, the federal government, and the international community. Bringing the poppy farmers within the legal economy would also integrate the rural areas more firmly within the structure of the Afghan state. Integrating poppy farmers and their communities into the legal economy will effectively drive a wedge between those communities and the Taliban insurgency. It turns the federal government and the West into the poppy farmers' business partners, severing their current business relationship with the Taliban and criminal elements. This counterinsurgency aspect of poppy for medicine is currently more important than ever as we see the urgent need to find ways to connect to the Afghan people at the local level in a positive way. In developing this approach, we believe it's critical to allow the defense and security forces of the West to focus their wide area surveillance systems, such as the J-STAR aircraft, on tracking ground movement activities as part of an interdiction and a monitoring project, so as to enable ground forces to effectively target the warehousing of opium, the interdiction of manufacturing into heroin, the supply chains, and the distribution networks of the traffickers. This important and expensive technology, which has been used to good effect in Bosnia and Iraq by the United States for security purposes, should be fast-tracked for use in Afghanistan counter-narcotics efforts, which to our knowledge has not yet occurred. We see the poppy for medicine approach as an elegant and innovative response to a seemingly intractable problem. There are many ways to implement it. We don't feel we can lose another year. We would like to launch poppy for medicine pilot projects in southern Afghanistan as soon as possible. Another option is a one-harvest amnesty program, allowing us to test buying opium for the morphine production phase. I wanted to focus today on poppy for medicine, but I'd like to close by noting that we believe today's approaches to the Afghanistan issue must be marked by significant new fulcrums in our relationships with the Afghan people. Our current research on the recruitment process of the Taliban focuses on inoculating the large number of young unemployed men from supporting the Taliban, drawing into criminal activity through the use of marriage allowances, family allowances. With all of these programs we characterize as non-violent security instruments. These types of new projects and the out-of-the-box thinking are what's needed in Afghanistan, and we would say urgently needed, and what cannot and should not be supported are cautious approaches and plans which are stamped more of the same. I'm filing today, along with my written testimony, copies of our research reports and other background information, which I hope you will find of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting testimony. I think one of the most useful things I have is a country report from the 2009 International Narcotics Control Strategy report on Afghanistan. And Mr. Braun, I'd like to ask you the same thing I asked Ambassador Holbrooke. This report contains that Nangarhar province alone shifted from having the second highest rate of poppy production in the country in 2007 to achieving poppy-free status in 2008. I asked what was this was attributable to, and he said a determined governor and an agricultural replacement program, essentially. Do you see this as any kind of a prototype which should be continued in other southern provinces, or do you see the fact that Nangarhar is a rich soil province, making it exceptional and therefore not applying to other provinces?
There's probably going to be some disagreement from my co-panelists on this, but I happen to agree with Mr. Holbrooke on this one. Not only was the governor responsible, a determined governor. I would say that there's a little tough love that goes into what happened in Nangarhar province also.
What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, you know, the governor laid down some very stiff guidelines. He banned poppy eradication, or excuse me, poppy production. There was forced eradication. You know, there were a lot of things that he did that literally turned the situation around in record time. Whether there was, you know, some negative or negativity as a result of that from the populace or not, I'm not so sure. Some say yes. I've talked to many that say no. The reality of the situation is that the vast majority of the production is now clearly centered in the southern part of the country. And just 2 or 3 years ago, virtually every province in the country, you know, we saw poppy production. So there's been a great deal to turn things around. My point, Senator, that I would say about this is when you look at where the vast majority of the production is now taking place, in southern Afghanistan, that is where we see the largest pockets and masses of the Taliban, which I believe clearly supports what you know, my point was in my opening statement. We're seeing this convergence of drugs and terrorism on the part of the Taliban. They're not just taxing farmers any longer. And by the way, that is the oldest form of organized criminal extortion on the face of the earth. It's been going on for a long, long time. But that's just like the FARC. That's where they got their start. They started taxing farmers. Then they began forming alliances and relationships with the traditional traffickers. In the private sector in the past year, Senator, I've learned that that's called outsourcing, okay? From there, they began to realize how much more money that they could make on the trade, and they began muscling their way in. And they've certainly got the training and the arms and that kind of thing to do that, to muscle in on the traditional traffickers' activities. But that's what's happening, and you know, look, I see quite frankly in my eyes, I think we've got an opportunity here. I think most of the trouble is in the South, and if the president chooses to send an additional 40,000 troops into the country, I think a lot of them will probably be down in that area, and we're going to be much better positioned to take the fight to the bad guys.
Thank you very much. Ms. McDonald, have you worked at, actually, you know, the manufacturing of some poppy for morphine in a very controlled way seems to me would make some sense. It would have to be a strictly government-regulated industry. My question would be to you, does Afghanistan have the ability to maintain a corrupt-free, highly regulated industry to produce this medical morphine?
It's an important question that we've been working on protocols now for several years, and we've looked at the Indian model. As I said, the United States supported a conversion of growing opium for heroin to morphine in Turkey and India, and the United States has a preferential trade agreement to buy the morphine product. We have developed a protocol that, as I said, we'd like to test, that is based on the Indian model plus some adjustments for Afghanistan. It's true, of course, we know there's no strong federal government in Afghanistan, but there's very strong local control, which is why we want to attempt this village shura control. We borrowed something from microfinance, which is the co-guarantee system. So a village would receive a license for cultivation of a certain amount of land, which we know would produce a certain number of kgs. If one of the farmers doesn't deliver, allows his opium to go into the trafficking networks, the entire village loses its license. So we have we've taken existing models, we've tried to look at the control systems that actually exist in Afghanistan, and that's what we'd like to test. Of course, we don't know whether it be successful, which is why we're calling for pilot projects and an expert group. The governor of Kandahar is willing to allow us to run pilot projects there, to try and see exactly how that plays itself out. India does have some leakage, maybe 20%, but we think if we could get Afghanistan down to 20% of its current production as opposed to 100%, that would be a worthwhile effort. We see it as part of a diversification plan to bridge a period of time until alternative livelihoods, which, as I'm sure you know very well, are going to take some years to kick in. And if there does become a diversified economy in southern Afghanistan, then the government could choose to discontinue its licensed morphine product.
Thank you. Let me just quickly go back to Mr. Braun. I'd like to ask the same question I asked of Ms. McDonald to you. I believe the Taliban is on a rise. I agree with what you're saying. I believe it is fueled by the drug trade. To what degree, I don't know, but I think a considerable amount. So it's no secret that both are in the South. And you've mentioned earlier that there's specifically 2 labs which are run by the Taliban. If you could get us more information on that, we'd appreciate that very much. And could you comment, do you think this could be done in a legal way anywhere in southern Afghanistan today?
Well, Senator, let me clear up one thing. I mentioned 2 labs. There have been many, many more over the last, I'd say, 8 to 12 months. Virtually every one of the labs now that the DEA is hitting in support of our counter-narcotics police colleagues in Afghanistan, supported by our military, Afghan Army National Commandos, at virtually every one of these things, lengthy firefights ensue. They're all being run by the Taliban. Lengthy firefights ensue. Some battles have been pitched for 2 to 3 days at these sites. For God's sakes, we're having to call in B-1 airstrikes on some of these lab complexes now. So I mean, I just want to clear that up, ma'am. There's far more than 2, and what I would recommend, and I'd be happy to work with your aides to help in any way, but I'm sure the DEA would be more than happy to come over and give you some very detailed briefings on exactly what they're finding at these sites. So.
Thank you very much. Senator?
Yeah, thank you. I hope you two over here aren't offended. I've got to go in just a minute, so I'm just going to ask Mr. Braun a few questions. You know, the administration's strategy is like, I think, makes common sense to cut off the flow of drug money to the insurgents, to stop their destabilization. I think that this is going to be difficult because of the Afghan economy using cash trade and hawaladars to move value. They've got an elaborate system of the latter. And I don't know whether you agree with me, you heard me when I introduced my, or talked about the introduction of my anti-money laundering laws, but if this is true that they use these other methods, and the only methods maybe, are any programs focused on trade-based money laundering?
Yes, Senator. Let me just talk about financial investigations and financial operations very quickly. And as part of that, I think you'll have a clear sense of the kinds of money that we're talking about that are being generated by the trade. The DEA for the last about 5 years now has had a very aggressive financial investigative strategy that it's about as simple as it gets, but it is extremely effective. And the strategy is this: with every DEA investigation that is opened, there must be a financial aspect to that investigation. And what the agency and what the agents and analysts have been told to do, and they're doing quite well, Senator, are apply the same exact tradecraft that is used for following the drugs against the money. In other words, follow the money just like you follow the drugs. One major trafficker in Afghanistan that has been brought to justice in the United States. He's pending trial, so I've got to be a little bit careful here. But the DEA tracked over $500 million in cash that moved through this guy's hands and made its way into the UAE. We've got an office, or the DEA has an office in the UAE now, and they're working that investigation. One other case, and this is pretty amazing. One other case, just about a year ago, a major trafficker's compound was hit in Nangarhar province by the DEA and Counter-Narcotics Police of Afghanistan. We found the treasure trove, the gold mine, if you will. We found his ledgers. And his ledgers, and this guy is strongly affiliated with the Taliban. In fact, there's growing evidence that he is a member of the Taliban. $169 million in cash moved through his hands and books in one 10-month period for the sale of 81 metric tons of heroin and morphine. So the kinds of money that are generated by the trade is a never-ending funding stream to the Taliban's war chest. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly. We've got to do a better job at following the narco dollars that are flowing out of that country, and we've got to find out where that money's going. But we've got some enormous challenges, Senator. In the UAE, the Emiratis have done a great job with respect to enacting money laundering legislation. Yet they only have a handful. I believe when I left about a year ago, they only had 2 investigators that were responsible for, internally, 2 federal investigators that were responsible for financial investigations. And so it's very difficult oftentimes to follow that money because we have to rely on our host nation counterparts to help us find out exactly where it's going.
Are we getting cooperation from other countries in the area or any place where maybe it would help?
Yes, sir, we are. We are getting a great deal of help and assistance. And if I could, there's a money aspect to all of this, but the DEA is one other point that needs to be made. We can't be Afghan-centric. We can't be Afghan-centric here. If we are, we're doomed to failure. So the DEA has a broad regional presence in that part of the world. We're working very closely with our foreign counterparts to not only go after the most notorious traffickers that are in Afghanistan, but also those that are around the country. And I was thinking about just some of these folks to give you some examples of some names, actually, of major traffickers from the region outside of Afghanistan that have been brought to justice. These are all major traffickers. Again, a guy by the name of Shabazz Khan, who was arrested in Dubai at the request of DEA. He was tried in the UAE, and he received 2 life sentences. A guy by the name of Khan Mohammed Khan was arrested by our Turkish counterparts at the request of DEA and our Afghan counterparts, and I believe he's pending trial. Hussein Rikabadi, this guy was arrested in Romania. He was a high-level Iranian broker for heroin, and Senator, you mentioned that about 50% of this stuff moves through Iran. So the agency's got a very solid regional strategy and actually global strategy to deal with this. And
then just any short answer you have for this, what's the biggest impediment to following the drug money and stopping the flow of illicit money, if you had to name 1 or 2 things?
One of the most significant challenges is the Hawala system of doing business in that part of the world. It's just, things just seem to, go into a black hole. You can follow it so far and then it goes. The way you break the code on that, quite honestly, there have got to be, we've got to engage in, and I'm not talking about just DEA, I'm talking about the intelligence community, federal law enforcement, and even our counterparts. We've got to do better at penetrating that financial network through very complex, extraordinarily dangerous undercover operations. We've got to be able to recruit operatives, and we've got to get them in the right places to peel back that onion and find out exactly how it works. Because I'm telling you what, Senator, 8 years later, we still don't really know how it's working.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Feldbau-Brown, could you comment on the activities in Nangarhar and how you think those have turned out in terms of our broader strategy and what the basis is for your assessment as well?
Absolutely. I think Nangarhar is an absolutely critical province to watch, both because it's one of the important drug-producing areas, has been for decades during the era of the Taliban, and has always competed with the South as a production area. It's also a critical province because while Pashtun, it is not pro-Taliban naturally. Many of the tribes have historically had deeply antagonistic relationship with the Taliban and continue doing so today, except when counter-narcotics operations conducted in the absence of livelihood push them into the hands of the Taliban, which is what we have witnessed. The first wave of eradication in Nangarhar was in 2005 under a different governor. With the same approach, essentially as a result of promises of alternative livelihoods, as well as enforcement through forced eradication and imprisonment, he managed to negotiate with tribal chiefs to bring cultivation down to close to zero. But alternative livelihoods never materialized beyond Jalalabad, one of the major cities, the provincial capital, and one of the major cities in Afghanistan. Jalalabad itself then has been effectively weaned off from poppy cultivation because the area is resource rich. It has good access to markets, it's a vibrant place on a route to Pakistan, and there are very many other economic opportunities, including in Jalalabad itself. Off-farm income is very important. The rest, however, was not the case for the vast majority of the province. 20 kilometers outside of Jalalabad, poverty was immense. Within a year, Nangarhar was back to the level of cultivation that it was prior to eradication. Since then, for 2 years, we have had a new governor, Gul Aga Shirzai, a former governor of Kandahar and a person of rather notorious qualification in Afghanistan, coming from a different province. He was, again, highly motivated to suppress cultivation, hoping he would be a presidential candidate. In fact, he did until he pulled out, and trying to carry favor with the international community. Once again, as a result of promises of alternative livelihoods, as well as enforcement, threats that NATO would bomb houses of those who cultivate opium poppy, he suppressed poppy close to zero. Once again, the pattern was exactly the same. Alternative livelihoods did not materialize. Poverty was immense. Income fell by 90%. Much of the province tried going abroad to Pakistan, to the madrasas that feed the Deobandi movement. Districts such as Shinwar, Cochin, Ajiani, along the border with Pakistan, became deeply destabilized. Intelligence provision to NATO forces has dried up. To an unprecedented degree, Nangarhar has become deeply destabilized in a way we have not seen since 2001. Although these tribes are not naturally pro-Taliban, we see immense level of Taliban mobilization and support. The 3 districts I mentioned have become no-go zones for government. This is increasingly true of other provinces. And since the whole province became so deeply destabilized and insecurity rose, even Jalalabad, the provincial market itself, has suffered economic decline, which in turn has led to a rise in criminality and once again support for the Taliban.
So you'd say that it backfired?
Absolutely, in an immense way. And because alternative livelihoods have been so focused on Jalalabad itself, because insecurity doesn't permit whether government officials or NGO workers to go outside, it's unsustainable because there is simply nothing left in vast chunks of the province.
And you use the phrase in your testimony, premature eradication. So your concern isn't that the eradication itself took place, but that it took place in the absence of adequate economic support or replacement.
Absolutely. The eradication efforts that originally took place around Jalalabad, I think well placed. There were legal resources, and the farmers that were subjected to eradication switched to diversified crop portfolios that frequently bring greater income than poppy itself, and were doing rather well, and to some extent continue doing well. The problem is, once you hit the areas 20, 30 kilometers outside of Jalalabad, where there is no access to markets, where there are no markets, no infrastructure, no microcredit, no access to land, short of renting, for being a sharecropper, short of renting against opium poppy. These areas suffer tremendously, and eradication is counterproductive by strengthening the bond between the Taliban and the population, and ineffective because there is nothing that can come in to replace the economy.
Let me jump to Ms. McDonald on the subject of the microcredit element of this. It strikes me that the poppy crop is unique in that the Taliban, in particular the dealers, were in a position to actually advance funds to farmers. So when you eradicate the next year's advancement doesn't come, and they get hit very hard right away. And there's no established microcredit that I'm aware of. How, in your proposal for the Poppies to Medicine program, would the local organization that is engaged in the manufacture and assures the quality of the morphine tablet, how would they finance that same early credit to the growers so that they can step in the place of the narco traffickers?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Senator. One way to put it is the Taliban are much better at microcredit than the international community is. But it does prove it can be done.
We invented credit and they're better. We invented public relations and they're better. It's quite astonishing how we've been defeated at our own game by these people.
Yes, it is, unfortunately. You're absolutely right that, as I said, one of the things that we think is interesting about Poppy for Medicine, it's not just a counter-narcotic strategy, but it's a counterinsurgency strategy to bring us closer to the farming communities as their business partners.
I just need to know a little bit. I'm about actually very shortly to be there, and I wanted to have just a slightly clear understanding of how I'm north of you, unfortunately, but I've been there. And on that subject, just a very quick question. Your field office in Lashkar, how is it staffed and how has the security situation been for it in the past years and to now during its tenure? What are you looking at?
My house is a regular civilian house inside Lashkar City, so if you drove past it, it doesn't have the markings of an international compound. I've been there primarily with my Afghan colleagues. We have an Afghan research team, so at the moment, I'm the only non-Afghan member of ICOS Afghanistan. So we travel as Afghan civilians on the roads in regular local cars, and over the years, we've become very familiar with the communities, the villages, the refugee camps. So I hope it would be correct to say we have some goodwill in the community. And so far, we've managed in this fashion. And Senator, you're absolutely invited over for tea if you're in the neighborhood.
If I get south, I will. But let's go back, if I could, before, I guess my time is out, but if you could just go back to how these pilot programs would step in place of the drug lords with the early advanced financing to the farmers. How does that mechanism work?
Yeah, so you have to combine the microcredit mechanisms with a village licensing model, which means that if one of the farmers in the group allows his opium to be sold to the traffickers, then the entire village is going to lose their license, which we hope will mean that if the farmer is being pressurized by the Taliban, that he'll turn to the rest of the village and say, we've got a problem here. So it's like it develops a bit of a community defense mechanism as well.
Does that, I'm not anywhere near as familiar as you are with the sort of tribal codes of Afghanistan, but I know that these are people who believe very deeply in the codes of honor and conduct and hospitality and various other things, Pashtunwal. And does that sort of communalization of the responsibility for producing the product fit into that existing code in a way that gives it more backing than
this is our thesis, and the reason we keep on talking about running pilot projects rather than saying we want to implement it is we want to test that thesis, and we want to do that in the difficult areas in Kandahar and Helmand rather than running pilot projects in one of the other provinces. What we're trying to do is find what already exists from the point of view of governance and social mechanisms and use them both from a counter-narcotics point of view, but as I said, to move the central government closer to the rural areas and to move the international presence closer to them. So at the moment, they're business partners of the Taliban, whether they like it or not. And for the moment, they don't have, we believe, functional alternative livelihoods. So what they know how to do is grow poppy, and they're very good at that. So we want to move into that space and say, we're your new business partners. Yep. You're going to be part of a legal economy. You won't have the police coming after you. And this will be part of a future that they can see that they would have with a functioning federal government in Kabul, which at the moment I don't think they see the usefulness of the Kabul government in their lives.
And to the very specific question of where the front money comes from.
It would be a simple microcredit program. And at the moment, of course, We also see in the counter-narcotics package, you've got the funds that used to be used for forced poppy crop eradication. You could use them to kickstart the business model for poppy for medicine. The modeling we're looking at from India and Turkey suggests that there is a functioning business model after you did the startup. But once again, that's another thing we want to test in the pilot project is what are the upfront costs, the costs involved in making the morphine tablets, moving them to Kabul, et cetera.
And Mr. Brown, let me ask you two questions. When I first went over to Afghanistan, the line from the military was, we don't do counter-narcotics. We're not interested, that's not our thing. Later on, it sort of morphed to, well, we're interested because now we've seen the connection, but we can't do it because we have a different authority. And by the way, it backfires and it's complicated and people get angry and we haven't figured it out. So I've never had a very good feeling about the extent to which we had really thought through where we were and how this problem fit into the picture and what we needed to do about it. Is it your sense that we've reached a state of competency in evaluating this problem and responding to it in an effective way in terms of the way the different authorities are spread between law enforcement and NGOs and our military presence and Afghan government? Or is that still pretty awkward?
Well, it's a great question, Senator, and I would simply say that, you know, DOD has turned that aircraft carrier into the wind and they're launching. Look, I lived through this as the Chief of Operations for DEA for 4 years and the Acting Chief of Intel for a year. What we did was we worked very, very hard over that 5 years, and the agency continues to do so, in educating our military on, you know, the nexus between drugs and terrorism.
I guess my question is, do you now consider them educated?
We educated some folks, Senator, but the bottom line is we saw a sea change with General McKiernan when he took over in Afghanistan. I know you know him well, and his successor, General McChrystal, has not skipped a beat. What was woefully absent just as recently as 18 months to a couple of years ago with respect to support from our military has completely changed. These operations that I was explaining earlier, typically you've got armed Predator aircraft overhead as well as AH-64 Apache gunships that are providing airborne force protection. They've got ISR platforms overhead collecting everything in the areas of the operation for additional force protection. They've got medevac standby. They've got ground-based force protection that are ready to roll in, quick reaction teams. I mean, I could go on and on. It is really turned into just a very, very you know, close working relationship between the DEA and between our military. And I will say this, Senator, that
we've gone from not doing it at all to doing it with great technical capability, and the next step is we need to exercise that technical capability in ways that doesn't turn the population against us and provide support for the Taliban.
Yes, sir. And you have to understand that when I'm talking about DEA, I'm not talking about eradication. That is, you know, it's non-existent at this point for the most part.
You're talking about upstream, hitting the
organizational attack strategy that's worked well in Colombia and Peru and Thailand and many places around the world. It's the same strategy that we've got applied in Afghanistan. At any given time, 15 to 20 major HVTs that are targeted. And by the way, nowadays, virtually every one of these folks are either Taliban members or closely affiliated with the Taliban.
Final question, and each of you would be free to answer it. I grew up during the time of the conflict in Southeast Asia and had some exposure to the various crop replacement strategies when narcotics were a big issue in Southeast Asia. And what we found was that almost any time we went in to try to get involved in a market in the way that poppies for medicine might do, all that did was encourage expanded production because it added a market to an existing market. And one of the factors that made that possible was the fact that this was a geographically lush area in which security was really the only limiting factor for the growth of the poppy. And so if you had to plant 2-3 times as much, you could plant 2-3 times as much, and there was no real limit to that. Just from flying around in southern Afghanistan, I mean, it looks like the moon. You couldn't plant a thing there except in these narrow ribbons along the edges of the rivers. And it just, that gives me the very uneducated sense that this is a slightly different situation than Southeast Asia was, and that the limitations on the extent to which poppy cultivation in Kandahar and Helmand particularly can be increased, while there's sort of economic analysis that shows that's justified, there's kind of a geographic imperative that creates limits there. And I just want your thoughts on that observation. Is that credible, or could they quadruple the crop within the existing geographic limitation without hesitation? And so they're nowhere near that geographic bound. And we'll go right across. Ms. McDonald, Ms. Feldbaugh-Brown, Mr. Brown.
I mean, I think you're right. The poppy's a very metropolitan plant, but it does require certain minimal conditions. One of the things we've said in the poppy for medicine protocols that I mentioned briefly was to start using the J-star capacity, which is being used by the United States in Iraq, which is allowing that ground radar system to track. What we're trying to do in a counter-narcotics policy, and I think that's what you've heard today, is we're trying to make friends with the people we want to be friends with and really go after the people who are the troublemakers. And the local community in Afghanistan are the people we want to bring close to us, and the traffickers and the guys at the top, and I would reiterate, those who are involved in the provincial and federal governments are the ones that we want to focus on. So that's why we see this Poppy for Medicine as allowing us to divide those two.
Ms. Feldbaugh-Brown.
There are actually very many limiting factors on the size of poppy cultivation. Actually, poppy is only cultivated on 3% of arable land, so there are vast opportunity to expand, and yet expansion doesn't take place, even though we have seen massive overproduction. One immediate limitation
is that true even in Kandahar and Helmand, as opposed to, I mean, Nangarhar as much strikes me as a more hospitable landscape, and one in which there's more opportunity for a whole variety of crops, and therefore I'm not, so my question to you specifically is your 3% number true?
The 3% is countrywide. Nonetheless, there are opportunities for great expansion in Uruzgan, Farah, even in Helmand. This year and past year, we have seen sizable devotion of land to wheat for a variety of reasons that we can get into, and that I don't believe is necessarily sustainable, but poppy can expand anywhere. And it can go in the north, as we have seen. The big limitation is, of course, market saturation, and market has been oversaturated for a long time, but it's also individual decisions, including the fact that poppy is extraordinarily labor-intensive. That is both one advantage of poppy, but also its limitations. Yeah. Because beyond certain plot, the family cannot afford to either hire labor or to collect enough of the resin to produce poppy. I would like to make one, and that also provides opportunity for rural development strategies where many crops liberate labor, and the families like that because they can generate off-farm income as long as there are opportunities.
Orchards, for instance, are easier.
Right. I would like to make one comment about your previous experience with Southeast Asia, where I think, once again, Southeast Asia is very informative. Because it is the area, namely Thailand, that we have seen the most successful rural development program in the context of counter-narcotics anywhere in the world. And I think we can learn much in what has happened in Thailand, what the advantages were, what some of the limitations of the program were, that should really inform the debate about how we look at rural development in Afghanistan and how we sequence policies. One of the important factors was that insurgencies were defeated, and one reason they were defeated was because the government led up on eradication. Then rural development took place for about 5 years without forced eradication, at which point it was being determined that resources were sufficient for the community to switch to legal livelihoods, and forced eradication became part of the mixture of policies at that point, and the whole effort continued for several more decades, and has been indeed greatly successful at bringing cultivation down to close to zero.
That's why Afghanistan is where it is. Mr. Brown, last comment, and then we'll conclude the hearing.
I grew up in the same era, Senator. In fact, I caught the last 7 months of that conflict when I was serving in our military. But look, I'm not an expert on alternative livelihood, but here's what I do know. There's a sense of desperation around town, and probably rightfully so, with respect to what's happening in Afghanistan. There are some very smart people talking about some very stupid things, quite frankly, over at state, over at defense, and in the intel community. What seems to be resurfacing, and I've had a lot of folks that I've worked with very closely in those organizations over the years that are calling me and asking some questions. The issue or the subject of why don't we just buy all of the opium from the farmers? We could afford to do it, and we'd take this problem would probably resolve itself overnight. That's been tried, Senator, several places around the globe. Many times it's never worked. What happens is you end up with every farmer in the country planting poppies that were not growing poppies to begin with. And again, that's been proven time and time around the globe. My response to every one of these folks, and I've been kind of bombarded with these phone calls lately, and it's coming from several different directions. Why in God's name, why don't we pay these folks to plant legitimate crops, even if we're paying them 5 to 10 times the value of the crop, which is typically what they're going to get from their poppy crops? We just need to think this through. There's a proven history of what has worked and what has not worked in other places around the globe, and we need to apply many of those hard lessons learned to Afghanistan.
I want to thank all of the witnesses for coming in. Senator Feinstein has had to leave for another obligation. The hearing, I believe, will remain open for another week, the record of the hearing, and in case anybody wants to add any additional testimony to it. And with that, we are adjourned.